It's an absolute pleasure being here. Thank you for having me. And normally I like to come in a bit early just to get a feel for the conversations happening in the room. And this morning has been very, very interesting, especially the panel discussion before now. Um, to give a bit of background to me, I'm Nigerian. I was born in the UK. I went to high school in Nigeria. I lived in Australia for about 10 years. Prior to that, I lived in Botswana for about 10 years. I now live in South Africa, and I'm what you call a diasporan. All right, so I've experienced what it means like be, to have the need to send money back home. And it didn't matter which country I was in, whether it was Australia, whether it was South Africa, it's really expensive to send money back home. From Australia, it cost me $20 or $22 to send $100. In South Africa, as an example, it cost me about 250 rands to send 1,000 rands to Botswana, where my parents live. And they also get charged 250 rands or dollars pula in Botswana. So $100 could cost you $50 to send money back home. Happening today. And I was very pleased. There's a lady from Bidvest, I think it was here, who mentioned the customer. I think the question I was missing in the entire conversation so far was the customer, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to solve remittances for the African diaspora. So as Mohit introduced me, I work for Standard Bank in the Emerging Payments Division. I manage international remittances for the group. But today I'll be actually talking to you on a personal note around African innovation. I'm very, very passionate about African innovation and things that are happening on the continent. It's very interesting. When I go to conferences, I meet very impressive African innovators who do incredible work across financial services, remittances, do incredible work in the ed space, agriculture space. But there's one problem. We never talk about them. And then we assume, because they're not there, when you search for them on Google, we assume they don't exist. And what I want to do today is actually take you through a story of some of the innovators I've come across on the continent doing incredible work and how that also applies to remittances. But before I get into that, let's put some positioning questions. The first one is, what is the time frame when you start a bank? Or when you start a remittances company? Remittances company? Are you remittances as part of financial services, right? Definitely not 2 years or 3 years, right? You've got to think 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Agreed? Right? You don't want a bank to start today and fold in about 2 years. So this is a very important point to make, right? So when you think of strategy, you've got to think 2 to 3 decades from now. And in those 2 to 3 decades, who is Gen Z, right? That's a new generation that's going to be in that space. They're most likely the ones who are going to be sending the money or using financial services. The question, I'm not going to try to figure out who Gen Z is, right? It's very complicated. Some people say they're born today, or they're going to be 9 years old, or they're already 9 years old, or similar. I'm not going to try to figure it out. What I'm going to try to do, though, is figure out what environment they're going to live in, which will paint a picture for remittances and financial services. Last point, will banking always be here? The answer is yes. Will banks, however, be here? Probably not. Right? It's a very important distinction. Will banks be here? So think about it in terms of banking. It's always been here as long as there's social interactions. It started with barter system. So trade, goods and services. You move to coins. You move to paper. You move to plastic. Now we're in the digital age. So banking will always be here. But imagine a bank that was existing in the barter system. If they never evolved, they wouldn't exist today, right? So these points are actually very important for us for the discussion I'm going to have on the remittances space. Now, how do you figure out the impact of innovation in the African context? I think it's very subjective, right? And you can see it in the panel discussion before. It depended on what your perception is. Some people said offline or cash is still king. Some people say digital is the way. You can see the argument is quite subjective. So what I would rather do is try and figure out what environment Africa is going to look like in the next 20 to 30 years. Give us some facts. I'm going to use stats and maths to do this. Anthropology, for those who know what anthropology is the study of human behavior, and some trends in the tech space. Let's start with the first slide. Numbers in 70 years' time. I expect to see the first stats. 40% of the world's large working population will be in Africa by 2035. 2035, by the way, is about 12 to 15 years' time from now. It's not very far, right? And by the way, we can't wait till 2035 to fix Africa's problems. We've got to start now, put the strategies in place, right? And this also is not an African problem. It's a global problem. So if this working population isn't ready, it's a global problem. More stats. 35% of the world's 100 largest cities will be in Africa in 70 years' time. It's currently sitting at about 10%. What this indicates is massive population growth, especially in the urban areas. Right, so when you think of your remittances strategy, this is very important. Of that 35%, 7 of those cities will be in in Nigeria. And Lagos will be the largest city in the world by 2100. Anyone from Nigeria here? There's one person from Nigeria there. It's a very good time to be friends with Nigerians. All right? Very important, right? So this means Lagos can't fail as a country, as a city, or as Nigeria as a country. Last point I'm going to make there is Antananarivo, which is the capital of Madagascar, will be larger than Johannesburg. Does anyone have Antananarivo on their roadmap? One person, 2. Ouagadougou will be larger, the 34th largest city in the world. Ouagadougou, capital of Mali. Anyone have Ouagadougou in their roadmap? Probably only you. This is very important to paint a picture. So when you use say, population growth as an indicator of economic prosperity, you can see where the corridors start to move in the remittances space. So if we move from the numbers, let's look at anthropology. And last year, I was very fortunate to put a conference together with the University of Johannesburg, University of Pretoria. And what we did is we brought the best minds in academia, we brought the best innovators in the digital finance space, we put them in a room and said, here's some hard problems, solve it. I can tell you that was the best thing I've ever done, because I got some insights that I never ever knew about in the anthropology space. And I'll give you some examples. There was a professor called Professor Walderman from Ethiopia. He did some research asking, why hasn't mobile money taken off in Ethiopia? It's done very well in Kenya, why hasn't it taken off in Ethiopia? And he presented, and it was a very succinct point that he came up with that I never thought about. And he said, what happens in Ethiopia, most people are illiterate. And I don't like the word illiterate because it implies you're not educated, but in the sense of you can't read and write. Right? So what they've done now, most of these people figure out the color of money as an indicator of the value. So 10 rands is green, so when there's 10, the 20 rands is orange, so I've got 30 rands, right? When you digitize it, they can't tell anymore, right? They can't read it. And what he says happens, the grandma who gets the money gives it to the kid, and they say, kid, go to the agent and get the money. And there's always fraud, because the agent sees you've got 500 rands, but give them 400. Always fraud, right? And I'm not interested so much in the grandma, I'm interested in the kid, because that's probably the first time he's interacted with a digital technology, right? So his first experience is most likely fraudulent. And that kid potentially then has to migrate, like we saw on the stats before. He has to migrate. And there's another professor from Kenya who did some research on remittances and migration. Very interesting, Dr. Sibyl. She did some research on migration. She tracked about 12 families, kids who, that potential kid has gone to, say, Belgium or France or the US, and where they're sending the money to. Right? And she tracked the money, and she found out the money always went to the grandma. And the grandma figured out how to distribute the money, because she knows you're in school, you need airtime, you're having financial problems, you need X and Y, Z. And the conclusion from a paper was to say, we assume that financial services doesn't exist in Africa just because people don't have a bank account. They already do, just in a different form to what we're used to. Right? She says the people who would do well in the tech space are those who actually bring in technology to support that existing system. And there's another research that was done, we're talking about languages. And the conclusion there was to say there's a high likelihood that many of us will have to learn Yoruba. Yoruba is one of the top 3 languages spoken in Nigeria today. And if you put this stat in connection to the one I mentioned before, where Lagos would be the largest city in the world, it's not far-fetched to think that Yoruba would be a largely spoken language in Africa. Think about China now. What do we do when we try to go to Asia? We want to learn Mandarin. All right, that's what we do. And this actually might be so far-fetched for you until you realize last year, Yoruba became a national language in Brazil. And most kids are being taught Yoruba right now in schools. Now, what happens from your remittances point of view? What happens from a coding point of view? Do you have to code in Yoruba? Very interesting thought processes to start to process. And then let's look at the tech landscape. So because I write quite a bit about African innovation, written a couple of books on African innovation, I've got to do research. And I've been very fortunate as well to have a database of African innovators. And I started to pick up some trends. And I'm going to use some Silicon Valley trends as an indicator here for the tech landscape. Google, tech and banking. For probably the past 2-3 years, I've always been saying, what if Google became a bank? Because in reality, they know everything about you. Like, you know when you're having a kid, because you do what? You type in pram. You know when you're buying a house, because you say, I want to buy a house in this suburb. You want to buy a car, you type in Volvo or BMW. So it's not far-fetched for them to become a bank. And then last year, they became a bank. They got an e-money license in EU, in Lithuania, and I think in Ireland. That's an absolute game changer. So for me as a techie, I find it very exciting. There's no better competitor than Google. But as a consumer, as a corporate employee, it's very scary to think of it that way. Facebook, KYC. Has anyone ever tried, I'm assuming most of you are on social media here, anyone tried to log out of your Facebook account and log in with a brand new device? Anyone try that? What happens? It logs you off, or you get an email immediately asking if this is you. That's it, right? And you have to be impressed with that. How does Facebook know where 2 billion people are at any one time? Yeah, they do that, right? That's very impressive. It's very impressive. Now think of banking. No, but talk about from a customer experience point of view. Think of it. Absolutely. We have the same access to the technology, but we don't use it. Think about banking. If there's fraud in your card, how often do you know? How quickly do you know there's fraud in your card? Much later, right? Think of a scenario here, say like, for example, with Waze. What happens when you use Waze? It automatically asks you, is this your home address? Right? Because you're parking at home or you're parking at office. Right? It picks it up. That's true KYC, know your customer. What happens if the banking world adopts this methodology? What happens? And it's happening today. Because when you log on to most e-commerce sites, they ask you, log in with your Facebook account or log in with your Google account. Happening today. And if that happened in your banking space where you log in with on your app and say log in Facebook or Google account, I personally think that's game over from a KYC point of view. Remittances. I'm sure you guys know about this. WhatsApp launching remittances or testing remittances in India. How many of you guys heard of that last year? Yeah, game changer. And the last one actually is, for me, is the scariest, is Truecaller. Everyone knows Truecaller? Yeah, so if you don't know Truecaller is an app that sort of filters out spam calls, right? Today in South Africa, 3 banks come up as spam on Truecaller. 2 telcos come up as spam on Truecaller. How can a small fintech out of Europe block large African multinationals? And we spend a lot of money on marketing, spend a lot of money trying to contact customers, but the fintech space has changed the landscape of innovation in the African context. And the last point I'll make on this slide is, has anyone ever called their call centers? Anyone ever called Google's call center? No. Why? Because it works. How many people call the bank's call centers? Many times. We call it all the time. And I have a hypothesis here that says there's a direct correlation between the size of your call center and the inefficiencies in your business processes. Right? And that's an important point, even from a remittances point of view. If you have people calling you all the time, there's something wrong in your system. And the conclusion with this slide is the disruption is already here. So when we talk about remittances, when we talk about technology, it's already here. It's not a product that's going to come in about 10, 15 years. It's already happening today on the continent. So what should remittances look like, or digital banking, in my view, look like with all this in mind? So I sort of try to paint a picture. We talked about anthropology. We talked about the stats and numbers. We talked about the tech trends. And I'm going to put some context here. So when I move from one country to the next, I do this. I keep my WhatsApp profile. Right? I don't change it. I just change the number. I keep my email address. I keep my social media profile. Why not my bank account? Yes, thank you. Why not my bank account? Why do I have to start from scratch every single time? And my view is any remittance player or any bank who solves this will usher in the new era of remittances experiences for the African diaspora. And by the way, this is part of what I'm trying to solve in Standard Bank. Thank you. Thank you. So the question then becomes, how do we know we're making progress? So this is very good, Nnamdi, you're talking and you've done all this research, but how do we know we're making progress? And because I'm an engineer, I like to use, I like facts. So I'm going to use some mathematical theory to explain some concept. The diffusion innovation theory, there's a law of large numbers, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then that almost give you a view on how to actually provide banking services to the diaspora or any particular sector you're targeting. Let's talk about the diffusion innovation theory. I'm assuming some of you know this. Does anyone know about diffusion innovation theory? If you're in marketing, by the way, you should know this theory, and it's quite simple. So let's assume you're launching the new iPhone 10, and you're targeting an audience of, say, 1 million people. You need to get to, I don't know if you can see there, you need to get to a critical mass of about 15%. Right, so 15% of your people should use your product, right? And there's a subset of that, which is about 2.5%, which are called innovators. So these are the crazy guys who queue outside to get the iPhone 10 when they can get it for half price the next day, right? So that's a theory, right? So like if you apply this same theory to Africa and innovation or even financial services, at 1.2 billion people, at about 15%, if you can see there, we need about 250 million Africans just to be positive about our continent, right? Who say we're going to do stuff to make Africa move forward. At about 2.5%, the innovators, these are the guys, entrepreneurs in African continents who say we're going to push an agenda for Africa. The entrepreneurs who do impressive work. And I think our job when we find this 2.5%, there's about 30 million of them, is to support them and just move their businesses forward, right? I have a hypothesis that there's a subset in here which we're calling the visionary. So think Steve Jobs, right? People who actually, because of their vision, create more entrepreneurs, more leaders. So without, say, the smartphone with the slide screen, it would be very hard to have an Uber or an Airbnb now, right? And when you look at the maths behind this, you only need about 17 Africans to be visionaries. Only 17. I've only come across one so far. And my life's mission is actually to find the other 16. Because when we find those 16, then we're okay. When we're talking about remittances, then we're okay. And our job is when we find them, we just roll out the red carpet. So when they come to Standard Bank or they come to MTN, we don't make life difficult for them. You understand where I'm coming from, right? And the entrepreneurs are nodding their head. So the last few slides. Can we predict what disruption will look like in the African context? I think we can, right? And what I did was start to overlay the database I have of innovators on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think most of you guys know the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the premise is you've got to start from your base. You've got to solve the basics, feeding education, health, and the likes. And as you move up, you get to a self-actualization. In my database of innovators, I'm seeing a lot of them at the bottom end, solving basic African needs, financial services, agriculture, education, health. And the premise here is there's a concept that if these guys fail, in principle, we'll never actually move to the next phase, right? Or if new technology comes in to disrupt, say, the remittance space, we'll never move to the next phase. And you can see the same pattern happening in Silicon Valley. It already happened in Silicon Valley. So what happened, likes of Google, Wikipedia solving education, PayPal solving financial services, and then moved up. Then there's Uber, and there's Airbnb, and now there's Elon Musk trying to get into space, and Google is trying to solve for immortality, right? And now self-actualized. It's always funny when I say that in my head. But that's the premise, right? So they follow the same pattern. So in the remittances space, I think remittances is done, right? The premise of remittances is done, and I'll show you some examples now. The question is, what are you going to do with the asset you've got now to move to the next phase? So how do we capitalize on this? And this data is easily available online. I hope you guys have used it. You have the World Bank data on remittances market flows, right? It's all online. You have the United Nations Migration Overview. And this actually is very fascinating because they're two separate data sets. But when you overlay the two, you see the same pattern. So where people are sending money to is where they've come from. So very important, right? And then you overlay that with your strategy. And if there are gaps in between, you've got to plug those gaps, right? Especially if you do the projections and the likes. But my theory is this should be the basics. Like if you haven't done this, there's a problem, right? You should be able to figure out where these overlaps are and fix them immediately. My real concern is what next, right? What are you going to do with this asset? And if you think about what the lady from Bidvest said is, we're not talking about the customer. I think there's a fundamental flaw in remittances. We make an assumption that I want to send money back home. No. When my mom calls me up and says my dad is in hospital, I don't want to send money to her. I want to pay the doctor's bill. When my sister calls me up and said, please help me with school fees, I don't want to send her money. I want to pay her school fees. And I also want to buy her textbooks. So if we don't start to think of remittances in that form, I think the opportunity might be lost. And what I'm going to do now is just show you a final example on some ecosystems that remittance players can start to create. So let's think about the gogo from Ethiopia, the one who couldn't read and gave the kid the phone to get the money. Assuming she's got cataracts, there's a company out of Cape Town, actually here, called Vula Mobile, who developed an app started by an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor, who got frustrated. He used to drive 4 hours into rural areas to see Gogo, 4 hours back and say, Gogo, you've got cataracts. And she's got to drive back into Cape Town. It was very frustrating, very inefficient process for a 20-minute operation. So he developed an app called Vula Mobile. So a health worker can just scan Gogo's eye and says, you've got cataracts, and book her in to the closest ophthalmologist. They've processed, I think, done about 80,000 operations just last year, happening in Cape Town, but we don't talk about them. And then she goes for the operation. How does she pay for the operation? She's got no insurance or the likes. Anyone heard of MicroInsure? Yeah, some of you would have MicroInsure. The premise here is to provide insurance on the back of airtime to most Africans because we don't have the traditional KYC documentation. We don't have 3 months bank statements. We don't have proof of address. But what do? We buy airtime. So they figured out a way to use the airtime as a base to provide free health insurance for Gogo. So she could do that. She could use MicroInsure. She gets the operation. She can see. How does she know the medication she's got is genuine or counterfeit, which is a genuine problem in Africa, by the way, when you do the research. She doesn't. But a company called Sproxil out of Ghana, let's figure out, remember the days of the scratch card, when you scratch and get the airtime? They've put that same technology on the medication. You could scratch it, send an SMS to the number, and tell you whether it's counterfeit or genuine. Happening today in Africa. She could use that to figure out. She could get home. Now she could see M-Kopa, which is a product out of Kenya. PSU Go Solar. Instead of using kerosene, she can use M-Kopa. Her son can send her money using MFS Africa, right? And she could pay with that via M-Pesa. This ecosystem we can put today, because they all exist. And just out of curiosity, how much do you think this would cost Gogo? Any show of hands? Most people think $10, $20. It costs her 40 US cents. So our question is, why haven't we put this ecosystem together? And if I'm challenging the remittances industry today, so start to think of ways to elevate from thinking of just pure sending money to actually creating ecosystems in Africa. And I'm just going to end with my favorite African innovator of all time. So I get to see a lot of innovators across the continent do impressive work. Her name is Fatima Alfiri. Right? So she moved to Tunisia from Morocco when she was a kid with her dad and a sister. You know, her dad passed away. He was a businessman. He had some cash and he left it to her as an inheritance from his business. There's an interesting twist here. What she did, she used that money to found a university in Morocco. But the twist here is that she was born over 1,000 years ago. And her university that she founded was the first university in the world. How many people knew about her story? 2. Usually it's none. Oh, there you go. There you go. So some people know about her university. Usually it's none. And I ask myself the question, why don't we tell our own stories? Why don't we tell our own stories? I come across such impressive African innovators doing impressive stuff. Put the context. A female Muslim in Morocco 1,000 years ago founded the first university. If she never did it, would we have a Harvard today? Would we have Oxford? And the question is, we have innovators who walk in our doors, whether it's banking, whether it's remittance companies, whether it's the telcos, and the question is, can we help them? And I hope the answer is yes. Thank you very much, guys.